Testing.
What are you doing, Trevor?
Oh,
Excuse me. Funny. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start. I want to welcome you to the Legacy Lake County Tribal Health Garden. And we have the privilege of having Gabriele here. She is a wonderful master gardener with how many years of experience?
I took the Master Gardener training in 2005. However, I have actually professional gardening training from Germany from way back when I was a young person.
So at least 20 years. At least 20 years. So anyway, so thank you for coming. We're glad each one of you are here. And if you need water, there's water there. Everybody signed in. Okay. And then afterwards we do have a survey that we need you to fill out because we are grant funded and we need those surveys so that we can bring more good things to you. So anyway, I will hand it over to Gabriele.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you. Thank you for creating this wonderful, nice, shady space for us here. I really appreciate that. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, I want to make sure you all have our contact information because you can imagine that we cannot answer every question about gardening and pollinator-friendly gardening in 2 hours, right? It's taken me like 20 years to become somewhat proficient. So this is just going to be a little tease, you know. However, the good thing is I'm a volunteer member of the UC Master Gardener program in Lake County. We are a free helpline organization, and you know that's one of the things we do is actually I'm the only person currently who teaches gardening classes because we shrunk down to 10 members since COVID, and so there's limited amount of things we can do, but we do have a helpline, and if you have something to write down the number right now because any future questions will be available through that helpline. The number is 707 263 6838. And if you call there, then our office manager, Shauna or Nicole, they will give you also the email address where you can send pictures. If you need some plant identified, if you need an insect identified, things like that, you can send pictures in via email. You can then also in the future send your questions via email. And what happens is then when a master gardener comes to the office, which they're not sitting there all day long, because first of all, we're all volunteers, secondly, we're not many, but our office manager will notify us of any questions that come in and then usually email us the question and then we can answer it from home, or when we come into the office. So take advantage of that service. You can see there's a whole bunch of handouts about pollinator-friendly gardening and gardening for beneficial insects, and a couple other handouts I made for general beginner gardening. As I said, this is literally just scratching the surface of everything there is to know. So it's not a problem because we have handouts about anything you can imagine. Lists of nurseries, lists where to buy native plants, where to buy native plant seeds, any kind of list you can think of, or other information, and we can either snail mail it to you or email it to you on demand. So what I decided to start with is actually talking a bit about gardening for pollinators and beneficial insects before I get into the beginner gardening, because generally there are so many questions in the beginner gardening, it'll kind of go on and on and on, and I would never get to that subject. So what I have here is a whole bunch of posters of California native bees, and I did that because when we're talking in general about pollinators, people always think about European honeybees. I mean, most people, that's what they know about pollinators is the honeybee. Well, of course the honeybee is also a pollinator, and the convenient thing about European honeybees is that they make honey. That's why they have been favored above all other bees. The bottom line is, what we're gardening for is not honeybees. Let the beekeepers worry about it. And the honeybees will help themselves too to our stuff, obviously, but that's not what we're worried about. We are trying to keep the native bees alive, okay? Because those are the bees that were here long before honeybees were introduced, and they were doing a perfectly fine job of pollinating everything that needs to be pollinated here, and they still would if we were encouraging them a little bit more. And they still do to a large degree. Where I live, I have now a new neighbor who has honeybees, but before that, all my stuff got pollinated by native bees because I make sure I have enough plants out them to attract them to my area. And you don't have to memorize the names. There is, I can't remember the number now, it's something like 1,600 native bee species we have in California. Can you believe that? That's like mind-boggling, right? And don't think I can tell them apart. I can't. I have no idea. I mean, I can tell maybe 2 or 3, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that you realize the incredible abundance of native pollinators that is there and that just needs support, and they will help you pollinate your garden. You don't need to attract honeybees there, unless you want the honey, of course. Here's another picture, you know, to give you an idea if you want to read what they're all called. It's kind of cute, but honestly, I don't remember their names either. But it's not important. Now, lately there has been, you know, kind of a fad, and you've seen it probably on Pinterest and in other pictures. People are making insect hotels, right? Have you seen that? Bee hotels and insect hotels. And I have a lot of information in this binder how to do that. The basic premise is all these native bees, they don't live in hives like the yellow jackets or the honeybees. They have, honeybees make a hive made out of wax. Yellow jackets or other wasps, they make paper. The social wasps, they make paper hives. But most of the native bees actually live solitary. They do not live in a hive. They don't make any big nests. A lot of the native bees nest in the ground. So they actually need some bare ground, some of them, to dig holes in the ground to make their nest in. And that will be just one female bee digging a hole in the ground and laying her eggs and partitioning every egg off with different material depending on the species. There's a native bee called leafcutter bee, and you'll notice that because it cuts perfectly spherically round pieces out of leaves, and it partitions off the brood chambers of her breeding station with these round pieces of leaf. So when you find leaves in your garden that have perfectly round shapes cut out of them, you know that was done by a native leafcutter bee. And then there's other bees. They use fibers from plants to make little shields and partition off every single egg in their chamber. So there's an incredible abundance of, you know, different styles of how they conduct themselves. But it's usually just one female bee creating a little nest for her brood, right? So, of course, the ideal situation would be if you live adjacent to a lot of wildland, you don't have to do anything, because that wildland adjacent to you will provide enough habitat for all the native bees you can imagine. But not everybody, and I have the privilege of living in the wildland where I don't have to make insect hotels. I have like 100 tree stumps on my property and holes in the ground and whatnot, you know, where they can do whatever they want to do, what they always did. But if somebody lives in a really urban setting, things change immediately, you know. So then people have tried to create these, what they call insect hotels, bee hotels. And if you are in a situation like that, I would like you to encourage to do that. But before you do that, don't just go out and buy something at the nursery that looks cute. Don't go by how cute it looks to you. It needs to look good to the bee you're trying to attract. And there is specific length requirements, like people have put straws into an old can because it said on Pinterest to do that. Just put some straws in an old can and hang it up and bees will make their nests in there. Well, there may be 1 or 2 species of native bees who may find that suitable. You know, that particular diameter of straw and that particular way it's done. But it may be 1 out of 300 species that finds that suitable. And that one species may not be the one in your garden, okay? So before you build something like that, I would suggest you read up online a little bit, because I found that the most important thing to consider is these either empty stalks, you know, it used to be they use empty stalks of dead plants to make their nests in, Um, and people can substitute straws and whatnot, but what you need to know is how long they need to be. That's, for instance, a critical requirement. Like, some bees will not make a nest in a straw that's not at least like 10 inches long, because they have somehow realized that's how deep they need to get their eggs in there to protect them from predators that might otherwise get access to them, right? So this is critical information you need to know before you build such a thing, because it looks good to us, but it doesn't look good to the insects that they're trying to attract. So before you build something, inform yourself. There's lots of information on the web. The Xerxes Society, for instance, xerxes.org, they can give you specific information on exactly how these things need to be constructed to actually do what you want them to do, because that's important. Because otherwise you're just creating a thingamajiggy that hangs there and gathers dust, right? The other important thing I realized, whether it's for native bees or honeybees or any kind of insects, they need water. And not every property has water flowing on it, right? I live on a property that's like as dry as sawdust by nature, starting in April. So there's a little seasonal creek till April, which is then gone, and there's no water. So I started out putting out buckets and things like that for the insects. And then of course you realize within a very short time birds sit there, they poop in there and stuff falls in there. And that's not the worst part of it. What you find after a short time, if you do that, is there's actually dead insects swimming in there because they tried to get to the water and they fell in and drowned. So if you put out a bowl of sorts like that, you need to put something in where the insects, whether it's bees, butterflies or whatnot, can actually land on to get to the water without drowning. That's super important. So what I did, for instance, I have a big old cooking pot that I'm not using anymore, and I fill it full of water, and then I put this grid in there. So even if they fall in, they can get themselves back up on the grid, crawl up and fly out. But what a lot of people do, they put rocks in there. Some people put, you know, these dish scrubbers that, and the reason they use it, I think, is, even though they're ugly, because you can disinfect them. Because anything that sits in there for a long time is going to gather algae and bacterial slime, and you need to clean it every couple days and wash it out, because otherwise this becomes a breeding ground for problems, right? So put stuff in there where the insects can land and don't drown when they're getting wet. One thing I'm doing for the deer also, not just for the insects, I have a big bucket outside next to a water spigot, and it just has a slow drip 24/7. Just one drop at a time, but it eventually fills the bucket. The deer drink out of it at night, and then insects come. But you have to put things in for the insects that they don't drown, obviously, right? So that is the native insect part. We could go into great detail about all of this. The main thing I want to get at is planting for pollinators now. It will cross over into some other topics we're doing, because we're going to be talking about gardening tools. And planting for pollinators is not just good for the pollinators and the environment, it's also a gardening tool, right? One thing I actually forgot to mention, it's not just about pollinators. We don't just want to attract pollinators to our garden, we also want to attract other beneficial insects. And that's kind of a funny term, beneficial insects. They're only beneficial for us. They're not beneficial for the insects they eat, right? So what we call beneficial insects, for instance, would be a lady beetle, right? Now why is that beneficial? A lady beetle is beneficial because it eats aphids. It's not beneficial for the aphids, obviously, but it's beneficial for us. So when I say beneficial insects, that's what I'm talking about. I mean, they are beneficial for us because they are predatory insects getting rid of some of the pest insects we have. One of the ways we do attract all kinds of insects is planting native plants. Why? Is because the insects that live in this area have evolved with the plants that evolved in this area. So they need these particular plants that they've used for thousands of years to lay their eggs on, to develop to feed their larvae on, to complete their life cycle, right? It's not just about feeding. Most pollinators can feed on imported thyme and other imported Mediterranean herbs, not a problem. But this is not just about attracting them and feeding them. If we want to keep them in our area, we have to make sure they're actually able to complete their whole life cycle in our garden. And in order to complete their life cycle, they need the native plants that they evolved. That's super important. And that's the hardest thing to get gardeners to understand. Most gardeners, not in your circle, I don't think that will be a problem, but for the most gardeners, people buy plants based on what they look like, how attractive they look like to them, you know? And the problem with a lot of I don't think it's a problem, but for the average gardener, they think a lot of the plants that are native to this area only look good for 1 month out of the year when they bloom, which is, you know, like April, May, they look fantastic. And then the rest of the year, they either shrivel up and die, or they look very inconspicuous, not very showy, right? You know, take ceanothus for an example. Do you all know what ceanothus is? Wild lilac. It's a native shrub here. It comes in white and in various shades of blue and purple. It grows on the hillsides. When you drive from Lower Lake to Kelseyville in May, you can see the blue flowers. Anyway, ceanothus is a good example because it looks fantastic when it's covered in blue flowers. And everybody will think, oh wow, I want this shrub, right? And then they buy it and they find that the whole rest of the year, it looks like nothing. You can barely even notice it because as soon as the flowers are gone, it's a very inconspicuous, you know, dark grayish, greenish looking plant, just like most other of the native shrubs around here. And that is the case with a lot of the native plants. So these are plants that are not showy specimen plants for the most part. There is exceptions, yeah.
Are yellow jackets pollinators?
No, yellow jackets are not pollinators. You don't want to attract them. They have one good thing. Yellow jackets have one good thing. They are actually predators of some caterpillars we don't like. If you've ever observed when you have caterpillars on your corn or on your greens, yellow jackets will kill those caterpillars.
Oh, wow.
So that's the only good thing about them. But don't try to attract them. It's not worth it. There's easier ways to get rid of caterpillars. So what was I saying? Oh, we're talking about native shrubs and native flowers. You know, if you want to find out which plants are native to your area, there's a very easy, fantastic tool that has been created by the Native Plant Society. The Native Plant Society's website is CN California Native Plant Society, cnps.org. And when you go on this website, I think it's right on the homepage. They've redone the website and made it better recently, but it's probably still on the homepage. You can put your zip code in there and click enter, and it will show you all the plants that are native to your zip code. Not only that, it will group it into trees, shrubs, perennials, annuals, you know, flowering, non-flowering, aquatic, drought tolerant, I mean, you name it. It's a fantastic tool. So if you're wondering what kind of native plants should I plant on my property, you put your zip code into their webpage and it shows you exactly what the plants are that have natively grown exactly in your zip code where you live. Doesn't mean you have to stick to only those, but I think that would be a good start, right? There is a couple local Lake County nurseries that carry a fairly good selection of native plants, but if you have trouble finding what you want, then you call our office. We can send you a 3-page list of all nurseries in California that sell native plants and all places that sell native plant seeds, so you can get what you want. And a lot of the local nurseries are willing to order the stuff for you from the wholesale nursery if you talk to the nursery owner. I know Tanya in Middletown, she will order stuff for you that you want, especially, you know, so that can be done. But usually during planting season they have a lot of it available. And now comes the second important part. The best time to plant the native plants is not now. Okay, now is the worst time to plant them because we're about to go into the hot, dry season. When you plant a plant, almost any shrub tree, the time you want to plant it is just before the rainy season, at the beginning of the rainy season, or during the dormant season. Because then it actually has about 3 months to establish a little bit of a root system so it can survive the coming hot, dry season. You know how say, well, native plants survive without human help, without watering, blah, blah, blah. Well, that is, if a native seed falls into the ground and sprouts, it will immediately develop a huge root system. That's what makes it survive, not some other magical property. It's the root system that makes it survive. So if you buy a native plant in a nursery that comes in a tiny little pot like that, that's already root bound, and you plunk that in the ground in May or June, you have to baby it just as much as any other plant to get it to survive, because it doesn't have that root system that makes it drought tolerant and survive our summers. And if you buy a native plant in the nursery that came in a small pot, I have found it can take up to 4 years before it can be left alone and fend for itself.
Wow.
I want to give you an example. I bought a Matilia poppy. That is a native. It looks like a fried egg. You've probably seen it. The flowers look like fried eggs, white petals with a yellow center, right? And I bought 3 of them and planted it on my property and thought, they were going to become very big shrubs because they get literally 7 feet tall or taller and huge. And that thing came in a pot. It was about that size, and I planted it in the ground and I watered it, not too much and not too little. And after 3 years, that plant had grown about 2 inches. After 3 years of me babying it along, it grew about 2 inches. So I said to my colleague Louise, I said, do you want the Matilia poppy? I think that thing doesn't like it on my ground for whatever reason. I'm tired of babying it along. It's just not made for my garden. She said, okay, well, next time you come to the office, bring it for me. And it took about 3 weeks before I came to the office next time, and literally 2 weeks after, that plant started taking off. Okay? I'm not kidding you. Out of nowhere, all of a sudden it sent out this big 1 yard long shoot, and then a week later it sent out another yard long shoot, and I'm like, wow. So this was in the 4th year, okay? Just to give you an idea of what can happen. Now that plant is 8 feet high and 5 feet around, and it's in the 6th year.
Okay.
So just so you know, you have to have patience with it. There's a gardener saying, let's see if I can remember it. The first year it sleeps, the second year it creeps, and the third year it leaps. But even that is optimistic, as you now know, right? So this is working with native plants, you know. So you gotta be patient, you gotta read up about them, you gotta know where this plant evolved, what it likes, what it doesn't like, and act accordingly and try to create an environment. First of all, find a microclimate in your garden that is most suitable, because every garden has many different microclimates that are actually quite different, you know. And so you find a microclimate in your garden that's most suitable, and then you try to give it the conditions that it would, you know, have in the most favorable native setting. And even then it can take 4 years to thrive, just as a fair warning. But there's a lot of other native plants that are much easier and you get much more immediate bang for your buck, and that's the annuals, the wildflowers, right? So until your shrubs get going, just plant a lot of wildflowers to fill up the space so you have something interesting to look at in the meantime. And be patient, you know. So that is the most important part, to plant enough natives. So when you want to attract a specific insect, whether it be a specific butterfly or a specific bee, read up on them and read up on which plant they need to complete their life cycle. The most famous example now is monarch butterflies. Everybody knows about monarch butterflies now because it's been in the press for, 10 years, right? So everybody here knows that monarch butterflies need milkweeds to complete their life cycle on. Do you all know that? Mm-hmm. Right? So we just take it for granted that everybody knows that. But there is 5,000 other native insects who also need a specific plant to complete their life cycle on. Do you know what I'm saying? So just because we know about one of the many thousands now doesn't make us knowledgeable pollinator specialists, right?
What would you plant to attract ladybugs? Ladybugs. What would you plant to attract them?
To attract ladybugs. What attracts ladybugs is aphids. Thank you for the question.
Okay.
So that's another good question. I love these questions because it prompts me to talk about things I would otherwise forget, right? So if you, in nature, everything is in balance, you know. Pest insects never get 100% eradicated because ladybugs need some aphids to eat. So if you're getting rid of 100% all aphids, all the ladybugs will die too because they have nothing to eat. You always have to keep a few aphids around to keep the ladybugs alive. So in my garden, I always have a few sacrificial plants, like some old kale plant that's going to seed that I don't care about. In my garden, a lot of kale species have naturalized. They have, you know, because I spread seeds around. So I have, in the middle of the garden, there will be 3 kale plants coming up, and I just leave them there because they become aphid magnets in late spring. And I leave the aphids on there. I don't spray the plants against aphids because the ladybugs need some aphids to survive, and other predators who eat aphids. You always need to keep a few around for some to survive. And if you keep a few around, then when you do get an aphid infestation on your prime kale in your bed, those ladybugs will go over there and will immediately multiply very fast and create more ladybugs. The ladybugs you buy generally eat some aphids and then fly off to the next station. That's why it's not a great idea to think you can just buy your native insects. You need to cultivate habitat for them to stay in your place. The ones that were born in your place will stay in your place. The ones that you buy from the nursery, they'll eat a little aphids and then they fly off to your neighbor's garden.
Do petunias attract aphids?
Yes. As soon as it gets too warm, they will attract aphids because they're not happy. Any plant that's evolved in a cool climate and is then forced to live in Lake County will attract aphids as soon as it gets stressed. When a plant gets stressed, it sends signal out to pest insects, please eat me, I'm ready to die. I mean, I'm expressing that in baby language now, but that's actually what's happening, believe it or not. Of course, it looks much more complicated in reality, but that's essentially what's happening. Ants use aphids like we use cows. Aphids don't give milk, but they excrete a sugary exudate. If you ever looked at an aphid closely, you know that out of their butt there's these 3 horn-like things coming out of their butt. And sometimes you'll see a drop of nectar forming right there. And you'll see an ant slurping it up. So ants like to drink the sugary juice that aphids excrete. And in order to do that, they actually farm them. Ants will put aphids on your plants, on a plant that's good to suck on, like a really juicy, nice, vigorous plant. They will put aphids on there and farm them to get the juice. So if you have an aphid problem, you usually don't just have to combat the aphids, you have to also combat the ants, because they will bring it back. Even if you all spray the aphids and you kill the aphids, the ants will bring more aphids back. But there's a website that will go into more detail than you ever wanted to know about that stuff. And I have cards with the URL of that website here. The IPM website, Integrated Pest Management, where there's like a 5-page thing on every single insect and what to do about it. You can read all up about how to combat ants, how to combat aphids, what to do, when to do it, and you know, the whole works. So bottom line is, you need a good amount of native plants so that native insects can complete their life cycle. Just like monarchs complete their life cycle on milkweed, every native insect needs a specific plant to complete their life cycle on, or several specific plants, so you need to have a variety. It's also good to have a variety of native plants that bloom at different times, you know. Try to find a bunch, if you're buying 6 or 7 plants, make sure it's not 6 plants that all bloom at the same time. Because these insects don't just need the nectar in May, they need it at other times of the year too, right? So you want to always have a variety of, like a buffet of nectar around for insects all year round. And it's easy to find plants that bloom in May, obviously, but it's not so easy to find plants that bloom in, July, August, September when it's hot and dry here. So try to find a few things that bloom at the time when it's hot and dry here to keep them around. And for that time, it's often helpful to keep some non-natives around, because there's a lot more non-natives that bloom at this time that you can find at the nursery. And they are helpful for providing nectar and pollen. Even though the insects cannot complete their life cycle on it, but they can at least eat in the meantime. So a great non-native plants to keep around that bloom a lot are actually all of the culinary herbs, believe it or not. So if you love culinary herbs, plant a ton of culinary herbs in your garden, because when they bloom, they are also great pollinator feeders. Thyme, there's a wine barrel that has thyme in it right in the back. That's a fantastic plant. Thyme blooms profusely even in the winter sometimes. I've seen thyme bloom in January, February when there's not a lot of other things blooming, and it will provide food for the insects that are out at this time. There's a plant right next to it, it's called Gaillardia or Planket flower in that other barrel. That's a native plant, fantastic beneficial insect and pollinator plant. I can highly recommend it. But you have the handouts that are available here that have complete lists of plants. And like I said, go to the Calscape. Actually, the website that is linked to on the California Native Plant Society website is the Calscape website. You can directly go to calscape.org to find the native plants suitable for your area. And then if you don't find what you're looking for in the nurseries around here, call us, we'll send you a list of all the California nurseries that carry native plants or native plant seeds. Now remember, plant your plants if you can before the rainy season, not now.
I was just going to say there are some local people that have native plants. That
Karen Sullivan is,
exactly.
is a great example. So administrator of the Lake County California Gardeners Facebook page that you should all join.
Say
I
it
can
again?
highly recommend it.
Lake County, California.
Lake County California Gardeners is a Facebook page. And if you're on Facebook, I can highly recommend to join it because people will give away stuff there or, give advice or ask questions or tell you where to get this and where to get that. You can dip into other people's experience.
And she also brings stuff back from the
And
Cal
the
State
administrator,
Nursery.
Karen Sullivan, used to have a native plant nursery here. Now she doesn't have an official nursery anymore, but she still will grow plants for specific events, and she will find any plant you need for you. I can highly recommend it. You can ask her, you can message her on her Facebook page. Then I also recommend you to plant a ton of culinary herbs, especially for beginning gardeners. Because a lot of the Mediterranean herbs have evolved in a very similar climate to what's going on in Lake County. So they all do well here. And they can help bridge the gap, during times when there's not a lot of natives blooming in your garden. And just provide some more volume. And the bonus is you can eat them and, use them as spice in your food. Thyme is a great example. Lavender, oregano is fantastic. There's probably 10, 15 different kinds of oregano. Some of them edible, some not, but they're all great for insects to have. Some of them look very showy, so delve into the herbs. The nice thing about all these culinary herbs is they are much easier to grow than vegetables. So if you're a beginning gardener, we were talking a little bit, this gentleman and I were talking a little bit before class. He has never gardened, he has a big property and needs to do something with it. Grow herbs. It's the easiest thing to grow. You cannot go wrong. And even if you get nothing to eat out of it, you're doing a wonderful job for your local pollinators and beneficial insects, and that alone is totally worth it, right? Not to mention the beautiful visual thing for just walking through your garden, smelling the herbs, looking at the flowers. I mean, what is nicer than that, right? I remember the kind of help desk questions we get. For instance, because we recommended for people to plant certain plants to attract butterflies. one lady wanted to have more butterflies in her garden. So we recommended some plants for her to attract the butterflies. Well, the next thing happens, we get a call from her. Her plant is completely eaten down to a nub by caterpillars. What she should spray. And hello, okay, think for a minute. You're trying to attract butterflies with a native plant. Well, guess what caterpillars are? They are baby butterflies. And they need to eat. Because if you don't have caterpillars, there will be no butterflies.
So plant more?
Yeah, plant more. So if you're planting a plant specifically because a certain butterfly needs to complete its life cycle on it, what most people don't see in their mind is that part of that life cycle is in form of a caterpillar, not a butterfly. And it doesn't look pretty. And that caterpillar can totally gobble up that whole plant. It looks ugly, but that's what's necessary to produce that butterfly, right? So you have to plant a few of them, so you still have one to look at. So keep that in mind. Like, I have a lot of sticky monkey flower growing on my property. It grows wild, and I encourage it by spreading the seeds. It's beautiful. But there's one that's next to the house that I would love to have it look good. But that one plant is always covered in the caterpillars, and they eat it down to an unrecognizable nub. I don't know why this one. There's like 20 other ones in the landscape that nobody sees. There's not that many caterpillars on it, and the one that I would love to look at, you know, next to the house.
Is it in the shade?
No, it's in the sun actually.
Okay.
It's being completely devoured every year. But at least I have butterflies, right? So this is what happens, you know. So keep that in mind. Completing life cycle means there will be stages in the life cycle that may not look attractive to you. It's very important to know that insects, especially the insects we like, look very different in their different life stages. Okay? As you know, most insects, they lay eggs. Then out of the egg comes a larva, what we call larvae. That's usually a worm-like type of worm or caterpillar-like type of form that doesn't look pretty. And then the larva, when it has eaten enough for a month or so, it will very often bury itself in the ground and pupate. It turns into a kind of immobile pupa. A pupa is usually a reddish-brown thing that doesn't move much. And inside that pupa, everything will dissolve literally by enzymes into chaos and reform a completely new body that looks nothing like what you saw before. It's a scary thing, but they do it, every one of them, right? So the reason why I mention that is because I can't tell you how many times we have gotten help desk calls of people seeing these things on their plants and asking us how to kill them. Do you see that? It looks like a orange-black alligator-like thing up in the corner here. This is the larva of the lady beetle. And I always see people wanting to kill it because they don't get it, that this is a baby lady beetle. You know, they want lady beetles, but they're trying to kill these things. Well, this is what lady beetles look like when they're young. So get yourself one of these handouts and familiarize yourself with what the good guys look like when they're babies. Because I bet you a lot of you have killed them inadvertently thinking this is a pest insect. At least 85% of all insects we have here are not pests. So just because you see an insect on your plant does not mean you have to kill it, okay? 85% of all insects are not pests. Now, of those 85%, maybe only 10% are what we would call beneficial insects, like doing something for us, right? But the other 70% are neutral, harmless insects just stopping by, doing their thing, not hurting anything, okay? So not every insect you see on a plant is a bad insect. So before you try to kill something, catch it and try to identify it, what it is, before you do anything. So here on this handout, you can see the immature forms of some, just as an example, a few beneficial insects. So you know what you're dealing with before you do any harm to them, okay? And the other important thing about that is most of the beneficial insects eat more pests in their larval stage than in their adult stage. That's important to know. So if you think you have to wait for the alligator to become a lady beetle before it eats aphids, it's actually wrong. That alligator eats more aphids than the adult lady beetle. And that's the case for most insects in their larval stage. They eat more than the adult stage. And that's why it's really important not to kill them. And if you, even after looking at our handouts and at the IPM website, cannot identify something, call us. We have 2 biologists in the office that can help identify everything. Okay. Bumblebeewatch.org. If you want to become a citizen scientist and contribute to science, you can go to the web. If you see a bumblebee in your garden, take a good picture of it or several pictures, and you can list it on the bumblebeewatch.org website so everybody can see, because they're trying to find which bumblebees are still found in which habitats. So they're trying to figure out where they've become extinct, where they're still there, and so you can help science by going to the website. If you see a bumblebee, take pictures and list it here. Say, hey, yeah, here, I saw that in my garden. Or one more gruesome thing. So one of the beneficial insects that is super important, because there are so many species that do so much good, are predatory wasps. I'm not talking about yellow jackets, even though yellow jackets are also predatory wasps, but the predatory wasps I'm talking about are for the most part tiny, tiny, tiny. Most of these predatory wasps are literally just a quarter of an inch, sometimes even smaller. And they are not eating pests by chewing on them, but the female lays her eggs into the pest insect. And then, just like in a science fiction horror movie, yeah, the larvae of the predatory wasp develop inside the caterpillar. Mostly they use a lot of caterpillars. So inside of that, if you have, like, for instance, a tomato hornworm, then all of a sudden the developed larvae will exit out of that caterpillar in a very dramatic fashion. Of course, the caterpillar is dead by that point, okay? But these predatory wasps kill a lot of pest insects by doing that. And they are attracted to plants that have flowers that have the form of an umbel. You know what an umbel is? An umbel is a botanical name for flowers that look like umbrellas. Like a yarrow, you know what yarrow looks like? Or a wild carrot, or a poison hemlock. Anyway, angelica, you all know what angelica flowers look like probably. That's called an umbel. It's like a little umbrella-shaped flower. And a lot of predatory wasps are attracted to these flowers, so that's a good thing to plant. And maybe even let some of your weeds that look like that, like the wild carrot, survive, because they are favored by these type of wasps. Do you know what oak galls are?
I was wondering.
These balls that you find on oaks, sometimes they're kind of beige to start out with, then sometimes turn kind of reddish like an apple on one side. Well, these oak galls are something that the oak tree makes after the predatory wasp lays its eggs in there. And then around the eggs, the tree creates this gall. It's like a little nursery chamber. So that's a wasp that doesn't lay their eggs in a caterpillar, it lays in an oak tree, right? It's just an example, but...
Is it laid in the bark or the...
It usually lays it in the leaf or in a still juicy twig. And then this growth, like a tumor basically, this tumor forms around it. The tree just forms a tumor to contain the invader. From the tree's point of view, this is a tumor to contain the invader. But from the wasp's point of view, it's a fantastic bedroom for her kids. So it's, works for both of them. And for humans, it's just an interesting little ball.
So the oak galls have a beneficial.
Yes, so oak galls are beneficial. They don't do any harm to the tree. If a tree has 100
How can
oak...
you tell if the parasite
Well,
of the wasp
it will eventually disintegrate when you can see the holes where the little wasps come out.
Okay.
It will have exit holes.
I always thought those would make interesting Christmas tree decorations.
Yeah, and after they leave, it will kind of turn into a cork-like thing and disintegrate. Okay.
Good for fire starter.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So it just reminded me because that's also a wasp nursery, but a lot of these wasps that we call beneficial because they're beneficial for us, they're not beneficial for the caterpillars, right? That they lay their eggs in, obviously. I've seen a little oak tree that had like literally 200 of those on it, and in that case, it was not that the oak galls killed the oak tree. The oak tree was dying already. So when a tree is dying, it kind of gets taken over. It's like when a plant's not doing well, it gets killed off by aphids. When a tree is already stressed, it tends to send out signals to be finished off by other things, right? Whether they're insects or whatnot. So it's not those wasps that killed the oak tree. But the fact that there's 100 galls on a little oak tree tells you that that tree is not doing well. But it has nothing to do with that. That is a secondary thing that happens, is what I'm saying. Every mature oak tree can handle a few of those without having any problems whatsoever. So I was doing a little bit of show and tell about utensils you're going to need in Lake County. I find if you garden in the ground, this is indispensable. It's not a pitchfork, it's a digging fork. The difference is pitchfork is made to move hay. That's made to move hay, not to dig up the ground. This thing is made to loosen the ground. So a lot of times, after the initial digging up with a spade and shovel or you know, moving the ground in big ways, we don't actually want to disturb the layers of the ground in our vegetable bed after the first year anymore. Because there's, you know, wormholes that form, and every layer has its microbial population that thrives there, and worms that thrive there, and that constant turning everything upside down is actually not all that great. So all you need to do is get that in up to here, and then wiggle it a little bit, which loosens up the soil, creates some air pockets, the air can come in, the water can flow through better. So a lot of the times this is all I use. I don't use a shovel that much. Indispensable, so don't try to do it with this. This is made for moving hay.
That one goes for compost too.
Yeah, exactly. Moving compost, hay, things like that. This is something that few people know, that's why I want to show it to you. It's called a hula hoe. So instead of a regular hoe, that's basically just a thing that kind of snaps weeds at ground level. This is something that kills weeds below ground level. So what you do is, you get that underground, so you can snap the stem of the weed under the ground, not just at ground level. It's really helpful for that. Of course, you need to sharpen that.
Oh yeah.
You need to sharpen that frequently so it actually does that, right? It's a nifty little thing to have. I like it. I have one. This would be the regular hoe, which is good too. If you garden in containers, get yourself you don't need a lot of tools for container gardening. Very, very few. If you have small containers, this kind of stuff is really all you need, you know. You can use an old spoon, and that's all what you need for small containers. If you have bigger containers, a trowel will be essential, and I want to talk a little bit about what to look at. Now this is a good example. You see what's happening with this trowel? It's not very sturdy, okay? I mean, you can go to the dollar store and get a trowel for $1-2, but this is what you get, you know? I mean, the moment you have any heavy clay soil, the whole thing turns into a work of art, okay? And the other thing that happens, if you try to bend it back into shape, it ends up bending in the wrong spot, and it's just, you know, I mean, it's okay to use for one day, and then it's basically garbage. So invest in just very few but decent tools. So for trowels, I got this as a present from the Master Gardener program. You know, I can't remember who bought it. They bought it to give out as gifts for once you reach your 250 hours or your 500 volunteer hours, whatever. We gave everybody a trowel. And I used this trowel once, and what happened immediately, the handle broke. One use in clay soil, because the aluminum part only went till half of the handle. No, the good thing was that this part was aluminum, so it doesn't rust, it doesn't break, but the handle immediately broke, right? This trowel is 25 years old. It doesn't look pretty anymore, but it's fully aluminum, it doesn't rust. The handle goes all the way, the aluminum goes all the way to the end, and then it has a covering, so nothing will break, nothing will rust. It'll last forever. And then there's a lot of cute things out there like that. That looks like a cute idea. You have a trowel and a rake. First of all, the trowel is too small for most things. For planting some small things it may be okay, but the rake, this rake is completely useless, okay? I mean, it's actually it's just in the way. It looks like you get 2 for 1, but the second thing is completely useless, so, you know. So when you have a rake, first of all, you want more tines than just 3, right? Because otherwise, you're going to be raking for a long time. Then the tines are kind of not at the right angle, I think. Bad angle. And it gets into your sleeve and gets caught up in your sleeve while you're trying to work, you know. It's just... So, tools are a thing that you realize after a while you get what you pay for, you know. And it's better to have less and good tools than to buy a bunch of junk. And I'm the greatest example for buying junk when I came here because, yeah, I went to thrift stores and wanted to outfit myself with... And this looked cute because it was metal. I thought it's never gonna break, right? Guess what? I didn't even find out until I came home that this thing can't be removed. The pour spout cannot be removed. So when you have a watering can and you fill it with a hose or you let it sit outside, leaves fall in it, debris falls in it. Well, guess where all that debris ends up? It ends up here and it clogs up the front. And if you can't remove it, you can't clean it. So, garbage, right?
It's got threads on it.
Huh?
It's got threads on there.
Yeah, you would think. That's why I bought it, because I thought it's removable. But then I took it home and somebody must have either glued that on or the threads are just for show. I don't know.
That's my tool.
Yeah, you can't get it off. So you need a watering can where you can actually unscrew the top because it has to be cleaned frequently. Otherwise, you know, those things get plugged up and stuff, obviously. The other thing I like with my watering cans, this hole is too small. Because in my garden, in front of almost every hose, I have one of these fan sprayers. So when I want to fill my watering can for something that I need to hand water with a can, I can't get that fan sprayer in there to fill it. So I have to every time take the fan sprayer off, put the hose in, take it out, put the fan sprayer back on. You don't want to do that, you know? So I like to get a watering can that has a huge hole here and has a removable. These are all important things, you know? You don't think of it. You just think, oh, that's so pretty, it's blue, and, you know. It needs to be functional. If it's pretty on top of it, that's great, but more than anything, it needs to be functional, right? Yeah. Another essential thing in Lake County, and I have 2 examples of it here. I garden, my vegetable gardening all happens in raised beds just like those, about the same height, and they're all lined with, all those beds are lined with hardwire cloth. It's that stuff, see that? Completely lined at the bottom so gophers can't get in, because if you grow anything without protecting the bottom, even if you garden in an area where nobody has ever grown anything, within a year the gophers will discover your vegetable bed and they will never leave again. Okay? It took me a year till the gophers discovered my vegetables and now they live there permanently. So I have every bed lined with this stuff, hardware cloth.
So you don't manage for the gophers, you manage for the plants to be protected from them.
Exactly.
Okay.
I protect my plants instead of trying to catch gophers.
Okay.
That's a never-ending thing. You know, I don't have time for that. Now with natives, you don't have that problem, and with the herbs, you usually don't have the problem either, because most herbs are so aromatically strong. Gophers don't like them. You need this at the bottom of every vegetable bed, or your vegetables will get eaten by gophers within a year. I guarantee you. Okay. Some people that start gardening say, "I don't have any gophers in my garden." I used to say the same thing when I moved to Lake County for a year. Not a single gopher, you know. I thought, I don't know what these master gardeners are talking about. I don't have gophers, you know. And then all of a sudden, pretty much exactly in the second season of, they were everywhere, right? So then I lined all my beds with that stuff, but that's not all. Not only will critters try to get to your stuff from underneath, they will also try to get to your stuff from above. I live in the wildland urban interface, very close to huge areas of BLM land, so there's critters galore. And I'm the only garden that has a lot of vegetables, so they all come to my garden because this is the Garden of Eden, right? It gets around, word gets around. So I have to protect everything. And I have a huge amount of ground squirrels also. And when you plant a fresh vegetable seedling, well, guess what? There's between the birds and the ground squirrels and neighbors' chickens and, you know, I mean, you name it. So every tender seedling that's something that I know critters will get covered. Now, I'm not putting this lettuce plant, don't get me wrong. This is for squash, for young squash plants. I made that, okay? So every freshly planted squash gets a bonnet of wire until it develops enough hair that the critters don't like it anymore. Now if I have a bed of lettuce or kale or whatever, I will use this construction panel material. You see that stuff here? So I make hoops out of that for every bed. I put this hoop over every bed, and this hoop can then be covered either with that stuff to keep it warm, like on a frosty day, or it can be covered with shade cloth. I didn't bring any shade cloth, but you know what shade cloth looks like. You can cover it with shade cloth, or if you need the sun, as much sun as you want, but you want to protect it from critters, you can cover it with deer netting or bird netting. I would recommend deer netting. Bird netting is horrible stuff. It gets caught in everything. So I recommend deer netting that has holes about that big. And so over that hoop that is over every bed, if I have a bed with young lettuce or, you know, other tender seedlings that will get eaten by the ground squirrels or the birds, I will put either shade cloth if it's a sunny day like today, or just deer netting or both. Or deer netting, and then on top of it you can put shade cloth if you need to, and then pull the shade cloth off. And that will keep the ground squirrels out. Okay? Now I don't know if that's that necessary for all of you. If you're living in the Lakeport urban area, you may not have that problem. But in my garden, everything gets eaten that I don't protect. So I'm ready for it now. You know, I wasn't when I started gardening. So if you don't want to do that, this is of course, I make these for every wine barrel. I used to start gardening in half wine barrels here, because that's a great container that's already closed at the bottom. Nothing can get at it from the bottom, except, that reminds me of something else. So I drilled holes in the wine barrels because every container needs to have proper drainage. You cannot plant in a container without holes in it. So I drilled holes exactly that diameter, about 4 of them in every wine barrel for drainage, and I plant my stuff in it. And then within 2 years, all of a sudden everything was wilting in these barrels, no matter how much water I put in them. It was constantly wilting. And I thought, how is that possible? So the roots are obviously gone. The roots, you know, if something's wilting despite the fact that you give it a lot of water, you know that plant doesn't have enough roots. There's either a pest in the roots or the roots have gotten eaten by a gopher or whatever. I thought it's not possible. It's a wine barrel, right? So I finally emptied one whole thing out, and sure enough, the entire barrel was full of these oak roots that had grown into the barrel through the drainage holes. These are some of the original oak roots that grew into the barrel from the bottom through the drainage holes. And these oak roots were sucking up every drop of water I put in there from the top. So the plants I planted in there got none of the water. It all went to the oaks, right? So I learned that if you garden in wine barrels in an oak woodland, you need to move your barrel slightly every year and make sure that there's no oak roots coming in there. So you just have to keep moving it a little bit and be sure to cut the roots. This is, you know, all learning the hard way. Anyway, but what I was going to say was that every wine barrel that I gardened in had a cap like that. Of course, bigger, the size. And I made the cap so it exactly fits the wine barrel. So So every one of my wine barrels that I still have, that I grow herbs in, like tender herbs, you know, has one of these caps made out of wire. And it's not just for predators to prevent pests. It's also because my cats like to sometimes lie on the tender, cool lettuce that I'm starting to raise. So in order to prevent that from happening, this thing goes on top, right? So it's a multi-purpose protector. So, and depending on where you live in Lake County, you may need all those things to get to eat your own vegetables. Maybe not in Lakeport, but if you're out in the wilder areas. Now this stuff is called floating row cover, and this is a really old piece, it's falling apart. But I use that when it's really cold, because I also have a winter garden going all winter. You know, I have lettuce and kale and Asian greens and all that all winter long. So when I know that it's going to be frost, I throw this over my bed cover. So like imagine your bed, and this is over the bed, and then you can either in the summer put shade cloth over it, or when it's frost in the forecast, you put this stuff over it. It comes in different thicknesses. It comes in really thin, medium, or really thick. So really thin is nice to put over your brassica plants because it keeps those white butterflies out that turn into green caterpillars and eat your kale plants. You know those? The cabbage, what's it called? Cabbage white butterfly. So instead of trying to spray something to kill the caterpillars, just prevent the butterflies from getting to your cabbage in the first place. Then you don't have to kill the caterpillars. So if you put just like a thin layer of the thinnest version, this is the thinnest version of it. I'm sorry, it's really dirty by now because it's old, but see how thin that is? If you put a layer of that over your lettuce or your brassicas, you won't have any caterpillars on it. So prevention is always, I always recommend prevention. Same with the gophers. So instead of trying to catch and kill gophers, prevent them from getting in. Instead of trying to kill caterpillars, prevent the butterflies from getting into the lettuce, right? It's just much easier that way. And also it creates a little microclimate, especially in the early spring. You know, that so the temperature, the radical temperature differences we have in Lake County between night and day are mellowed out a little bit by this kind of stuff. And I find, like where I live, now I'm in a warmer area of Lake County, I never need more than that for frost protection ever. I have lettuce and cabbage all winter long, never had any losses. Sometimes I do without any protection, but even on the coldest days, I've never needed more than that to keep my stuff going. So no need for greenhouse even, you know. Other things you're going to need, what I love and what I use every single day is good old-fashioned clothespins. This is what I tuck the floating row cover or the shade cloth or the deer netting or whatever else I'm putting over this bed. Just low-tech clothespins will hold it there, you know. That's all you need. I actually hang up my laundry to dry, so when the clothespins aren't nice anymore for the laundry, they go in the gardening clothespin pile, right? And that's, these are probably 10 years old and they're still good. I use those for everything. So that's my removable sprayer for my watering can. The other thing you're gonna need is something to tie up plants that grow high, right? So I like to use twine, but you know, there's all kinds of fancy. This is nice because you can make it as long as you want and then rip it off here. Sorry. Right? This is nice. And this can be composted afterwards. That's why I like that. Even though most of the time I pull it out because it takes a long time to compost and it gets entangled in your stuff. But at least it will not end up as microplastic in your landscape. Trying to really avoid having microplastics in my landscape. So it's important when you see like these things get old, as soon as they get old and start to fray, I throw them away. Because if you don't, they will start falling apart and you end up with microplastic in your landscape. I hate that. So as soon as I see there's anything falling off of it, the thing gets chucked. But that will take a long time, believe it or not. I mean, this thing is like at least 6-7 years old. So you get a lot of use out of every one of those things. Another favorite tool I wanted to show you is, that's actually one of my favorite tools. It's called an easy digger. It's sort of like a plow. So I make planting holes with it, I smooth out the bed with it, I weed with it, I use it as a hoe in my raised beds. I use it for so many things. You know, everybody has their favorite little thing, right? These are commercially available tomato cages. Everybody who's ever seen a grown-up tomato knows that this cage is not suitable as a tomato cage. I mean, it's not even half the size you would need. I've never had a tomato ever that fit in that thing. You know what? They make great cages for peppers. They should be called pepper cages because they're the perfect size for a pepper plant, and that's what I use. For tomatoes or anything else that needs to be contained or climbed, I make cylinders out of that stuff. We bought that by the roll originally, and you want it, you know, depending on what variety of tomato you have. If you have a determinate tomato variety, this would be high enough. But for any indeterminate tomato variety, it needs to be at least 6 feet high, right? So you just buy it by the roll and you make a cylinder. I think we have some.
Yeah, he's bringing
Trevor
one.
is bringing some right now. So that, I use that for tomatoes, I use it for climbing beans. Anything that needs to climb gets put in one of those. So that's a great support structure.
Do you prune your tomatoes?
Very little. Very little. In the beginning stages of growth, yeah, I prune them. My determinate tomatoes almost get no pruning at all. Okay, but the indeterminate tomatoes, I prune them down to 3 or 4 main branches, if you will. And then they are in that cylinder. So occasionally when I see something growing outside of the cylinder that gets pruned off, and if it gets too dense in there, when I have the feeling there's not enough light coming in, then I prune it a little bit. But the reason why I like those cylinders for growing tomatoes is you don't have to do so much pruning. Okay, yeah, perfect. Thank you. So the tomato plant gets contained by that. Now, when it has so many, you know, tomato pruning is a whole class by itself, but I'm honestly for minimal tomato pruning when you grow them in these, because in Lake County the sun is so brutal that more green material will actually protect the fruit from sunburn. So it can be a good thing to have the tomato bush here. Like if you were living in Pennsylvania, you probably wanted to prune it down to 2 main stalks and, you know, just have the fruit off of that. If you would do that here in Lake County, most of your fruit would burn. So you want more stalks here.
So if you're using that cage and you have cherry tomatoes, grape tomatoes, are you able to get to all the tomatoes?
Yeah, I am. Because that is big enough for my hand to go through. I can easily.
Okay.
Look at that. I mean, that's big enough. That's why I like these cages, because they're big enough for your hands to go through. You can get to everything.
Okay.
Harvesting, pruning, whatever you want to do, it's no problem at all. You know?
How big are those gaps? Is that 4 inch by 4 inch? Or?
I think they're like, I want to say 5 inch by 5 inch. Yeah. And it's the stuff they put in concrete to reinforce concrete. So you get it at the hardware store. So, if you look at your handout that says vegetable gardening for beginners, okay, I've tried to summarize most of these things as succinctly as I could. I also gave you a handout that says food gardening in Lake County, general tips for the warm season. This is a handout I made for a talk. I did it at church, but it has a lot of relevant questions and I had some left over. So I brought this too in case you find any. But the main handout is called Vegetable Gardening for Beginners, and like I said, it's not by any means all the information you will need, obviously, right? But what I can say is, now that we've talked about the tools, the beneficial insects we talked about in the beginning are one of our tools, you know, because keeping the beneficial insects around is going to help us not only get our zucchini pollinated, get everything that needs pollination pollinated, it will cut down on pest insects. because a lot of these beneficial predaceous insects will eat pest insects. And the more of a variety we have of that, the less we need in terms of pest control. So that's an important tool. As far as soil and planting mix, I grow everything in beds like that because I live in an area that has a little bit of serpentine, which is unsuitable for vegetable growing. And what's not serpentine is all completely full of oak roots. I basically live in a oak forest, so you can't plant anything in the ground. Number one, you can barely dig in. And even if you can dig in, and if you would plant your vegetables under oaks and water those, you would kill the oak tree. Because the native oaks don't want to be watered in the summer. So you don't want to plant anything under an oak tree in the drip line that has to be watered in the summer. I mean, you can water an oak tree in the summer once or twice, but not like every day like in a vegetable garden. So don't try to plant something that needs everyday water under your oak trees. You will cause your oak trees to develop root rot and die. It's not going to happen instantly, but it will happen, I guarantee you. So that's another reason why I did everything in containers, to avoid that problem.
How far away from an oak do you need to be planted?
If it's in a container that doesn't drip down a lot, you could put it even in the drip line. Like I have a few Mediterranean herb planters in form of wine barrels that are under the oak tree, but there's not much water coming. You know what I mean? You don't want to put anything under the oak tree where a significant amount of water are going into the oak roots, because they will rot. Well, ideally with your vegetable bed, out of the drip line at least, I would say.
The drip line
It's not
changes
always-
year by year. Where the drip line,
Yes,
when
it
it's
changes
young.
year by year. And like I said, I have an oak tree where I'm now under the drip line also. Even though I started, when I put my bed there, it was away from the drip line, but now because the oak tree grew, it's under the drip line. So what happens is the oak roots grow into that bed every year through the hardware cloth. So I have to double dig that bed every year and remove the oak roots. Can be a big problem, so if you can avoid that, avoid it. I didn't know at the time that was going to happen, so like I said, everything I'm telling you I learned the hard way.
So then as that drip line expands, you have to move your things that are going
Well,
to
it would
wet.
be good to move your bed far enough away so you know, even if that oak tree grows 5 feet out there, you're still, if I would have known that happens, I would have put that bed way further out there. But, you know, I didn't think about all these things when I moved to Lake County, so. There's a lot of other things I didn't think about, but
So are the roots going through that kind of thin hardware cloth?
yes,
Those small holes?
they do.
They're
Yeah.
breaking the...
My
hard-
planting bed that is lined with this hardware cloth gets full of roots every year. I have
Wow.
to double dig and cut off all the roots every single year.
But do they break the hardware cloth?
No, they don't break the hardware
They don't
cloth.
break it,
They just
okay.
come through.
And that kind of...
If you would wait for 5 years, it would probably break it. If
Okay.
it would get big enough. Yeah.
it wouldn't hurt the roots. Just 5 years. You
It
just
doesn't hurt the
snap
roots, but it
Okay.
will suck away every bit of water and fertilizer from your vegetable. Oak trees, I know they don't like water in the summer. So if they're permanently wet from the vegetables or whatever other, you know, water-thirsty plants you have around it.
them. That root rot, is it worse for a younger oak tree or for the older oak trees? Any difference?
It's bad for every oak tree.
Okay.
So for those of us who have a lot of oak trees in our yards, what is good to plant?
Nothing. You should plant, ideally nothing under oak trees. Honestly, I have a list of plants that you can plant under oak trees. It's all the ones that don't need to be watered in the summer, basically. So,
Well, I was thinking like miner's lettuce,
Yeah.
because it comes on its own in the spring.
yes, exactly.
And it doesn't-
Miner's lettuce
doesn't
is
last.
fine. Anything that you don't need to water, basically, is fine. As far as planting mix, what I've often observed is that when people get free compost, they tend to fill their entire bed with compost and plant in it. That's actually not a great idea. Your planting mix, for most vegetables, they don't want more than 50% at the most compost. The rest should be soil, right? There's a few plants that can live in pure compost. That's usually the squashes. They don't mind. They can even live in a compost pile. They'll be fine. But for most plants, you don't want to plant them in 100% compost. You want to plant them in maximum 50% compost and the rest should be soil. Starting out for a beginning gardener with seeds or seedlings, obviously, like we do here, for the most part, we plant seedlings here. Because the kids who help out plant and a lot of the adults are not experienced gardeners, okay? Starting a lot of seeds is a tricky thing, you know? The smaller the seed, the trickier it gets. Not just that, some seeds take a lot of time to germinate. So you really have to be patient and diligent, keeping them just at the right moisture level until they germinate. And that's not something most beginning gardeners are very good at, okay? I would say most beginning gardeners should not plant seeds that take longer than a week to sprout. Because you'll either forget about it, or you forget to water it, or you'll overwater it, or, you know, something will happen and they won't make it. So, number one, I recommend for beginning gardeners, either just start with plants. That's your best bet. Now, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that too. I brought a few plants. When we did the planting here, and every single time we do this, I go through that. And here, I'm going to put my gloves on if I can find them. Here. Even planting a seedling is something that can be done right or very wrong, believe it or not. You can even kill a plant just by planting the seedling the wrong way. And so there's a few things that are important about that. I brought a kale plant here because that's what I had at home. Yeah. And so when you have the seedling, first of all, this year we were very good at that. The soil was pre-moistened and all that. But I've been here in years when the soil was powder dry at planting time. Okay? Do not do that. It takes days before that soil, you know, absorbs enough moisture to make it actually habitable for this plant. And if you plant even a well-watered seedling in powder dry soil, that powder dry soil will immediately wick all the moisture away from the root ball of this plant and basically start killing the roots. So do not ever plant anything in powder dry soil. Really important. Okay? So then when you make a hole for planting, what we're aiming for usually with almost all plants is that when they are planted in the bed, that the soil should end up at the same level that it is right now. I agree. So the soil should end up at the same level that it is right now. Now incidentally, I have a kale plant where that doesn't matter, but for most plants it matters. Kale is one of those bulletproof plants. You can bury it up to here in soil, it will be fine. Okay? Same with tomatoes. Tomatoes, you can, if this was a tomato seedling, you could plant it down with the soil all the way up to here in the bed. It would be perfectly fine. As a matter of fact, it's even better because it would make more adventitious roots along the stem and actually be better anchored in the soil. So these are two well-known examples for where it doesn't matter. Kale, or all the brassica plants, basically. Everything in that family, and tomatoes. But for most plants, for the vast majority of plants, it's important that when you plant them in bed, that they end up with the soil at the same level that it is now, right? Now, the next thing I observed with the planting, especially with the kids, I was trying to tell them how to get the plant out of the pot. You buy a seedling and you're trying to get it out of the pot and into its bed as much as possible without hurting the root system. You know, that'll give you really an advantage if you don't hurt the root system. So the way you do that is you kind of press the sides of the pot a little bit. That'll loosen up the soil from the sides. And then you make the peace sign. And then you get your two fingers cradling the stem, but you don't actually want to squeeze the stem. You just want to put your two fingers around the stem, so the stem is being anchored by your two fingers, and the two fingers are resting on the pot. And then after I've pressed that a bit to loosen it up, then I'm turning the pot upside down. And you can see I'm not squeezing the plant at all. I'm barely touching the plant, and yet it is safely cradled in my hand. And after you've, pressed the pot a little, voila. Now this kale has been in its little pot longer than I would like it to be, because right now I'm redoing a lot of my beds. After 15 years, the gophers have finally breached the hardware cloth at the bottom. It's lasted 15 years.
Wow.
So now, this year, I have gophers in every single bed. And I have to redo every single bed, put new hardware cloth and take the soil out before. So I have a lot of vegetables that aren't planted yet, that should have been planted like a month ago. That's why this has been in the pot so long. So you can see, because it's been in the pot so long, it's starting to become root bound. What we call root bound means the roots are starting to circle, trying to find their way further out, further down. So when you have this is actually not a bad example of root bound. I've bought a lot of plants at the nursery that were in much worse shape than that, right? But this is starting to get root bound. You see circling of roots. So what you want to do when you have a plant like that, you want to break up that circling. Okay, you're pinching those roots off. Every circling root wants to be broken up so that the roots know they can go further down now again. So you're going to end up with that before you plant it. So then you're going to gently lower it into your planting hole. Yeah.
You're not worried about the sides? Just the bottom?
I'm not too worried about the sides. With kale especially, if this was a more delicate plant, I would also break up. And if it was seriously root bound around the sides, I would break that up too. But kale is one of those bulletproof plants that I'm not going to worry too much about, because I'm going to bury the kale up in soil probably up to here. And just like tomatoes, it will actually make more roots out of here. It will be well anchored. And then when I press the soil against it, you want the soil of the bed to actually make contact with the root ball. You don't want there to be any air spaces in here. If there's a space between the root ball and the soil, the roots will not grow into the soil. They will not jump across an airspace. Okay? So this root ball needs to make contact with the soil so that the roots move into the surrounding soil. And then the next thing you do is you give it a welcome watering. Really nice, good soaking. And then you're off to a great start. Now with some plants, kale is not important, but some flowering plants, ornamentals, they have a face. Meaning they clearly have a face where the flower looks at you, and they have a backside. Then you also have to, when you plant it with the face facing toward the sun, right? With a kale plant, you don't have to worry about that, right? So anyway, I just wanted to show you that. So even starting out with a seedling, there's things you can do seriously wrong, you know? It probably won't kill a kale seedling. There's very few things you can do to kill that plant. But with other more tender plants, you know, neglecting that could kill your plant. Or at least get it off to a really rocky start.
When you say face it to the sun, you mean the east?
Well, just general, like let's say you have a flowering plant like the Gaillardia, and it has already made flowers when you buy the pot. So you want to make sure that the flowers don't face north. That's about it. You don't have to be more precise than that, you know. And it's mostly an aesthetic thing. They will eventually turn around because they will seek the sun, obviously. But the plant usually looks nicer on the face side, right? That has been toward the sun than on the back side. So if you're planting an ornamental plant, you want the nice side to be facing the person who's going to look at it, obviously, not the wall. You know, that's all. When you buy seedlings, okay, you can all see this is a sturdy looking, healthy seedlings. It has nice dark green leaves. It stands up by itself. It looks energetic, right? It looks vigorous. That's important when you buy seedlings. If you buy a seedling that's already lying down, is yellowing, has frayed edges, and there's already some insects on it, that's not a good seedling to buy. Okay, so buying good quality nursery seedlings is important also. Don't buy things that already look sick, if you can avoid it. You know, try to get yourself off to a good start. It's really important. Because there's a lot of stuff for sale, especially at plant sales done by beneficial organizations. They're often done by people who have no idea what they're doing, well-meaning people who don't know what they're doing, and they sell really subpar plants that I can't tell you how many times, even in nurseries, I've seen brassica family plants for sale that were already flowering. Do you know what I'm talking about? Once a plant in the cabbage family is flowering, this is it. It's dead, basically. You're never going to get any food out of it anymore. So for a nursery to sell that is really not good. And unsuspecting clients who have no idea will buy this, will plant it in their garden, and it just keeps making its flower and then die. Because that's what brassica plants do. Once they flower, that's the end stage of the plant life. So don't ever buy, green plants where we eat the leafy matter, where you want to eat the leaves and not the flower that are already flowering. They're history. If they've been crowded in a little 6-pack for 3 months, they will start flowering. Because for a plant, the only important thing for a plant is to make seed before it dies. Let's just say that once this plant makes seed, it's done as far as eating goes, okay? So you want to delay that process as long as you can. Fantastic question. She said she bought 2 green bean plants that looked healthy. She planted them at home and they immediately died. Do not ever buy bean plants. Don't. Beans hate transplanting. They don't get that. You should plant beans from seed in place. Put a bean in the ground and you will have a fantastic bean plant. Don't buy bean plants. It's a waste of money. Because they will almost die. For somebody who knows nothing about gardening, this seems like a good thing.
Yeah.
Anybody who knows something about gardening knows this is a very bad thing. Okay? It's like buying a little tomato plant that in a 6-pack that already has a tomato hanging on it. That means that this plant is near the end of its life. If it has decided to make fruit in a 6-pack, you know that that plant has been stressed to the max, it knows it's gonna die, and it's trying to make seed before it dies. This is what's going on. So do not ever buy a plant at the nursery that already has fruit trying to make seed in its little pot. That means that plant hasn't been watered properly, it hasn't been fertilized, has been stressed, it's about to die, and it's trying to make seed before it dies.
So you made a comment a little while ago, you want to delay the going to seed as long as possible.
In
How
a
do you
plant,
do that?
in a plant where we're eating the leaves,
Right.
not the fruit.
Right. How do you do that?
So, that brings us into the fertilizer topic, okay? When you fertilize, for those of you who fertilize mostly with compost, will be more difficult, but if you buy fertilizer, you see on a fertilizer package that you buy, you'll see 3 numbers. It'll say 364 or 1053 or whatever. These 3 numbers stand symbolic for the 3 macronutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Nitrogen is a nutrient that creates mostly leafy foliar growth. That's the main nutrient you need for leafy foliar growth. The green stuff, the vegetative phase of the plant, right? So any plant that we want to keep in the vegetative phase as long as possible, such as kale, lettuce, anything where we don't want it to flower and go to seed because we want to eat the leaves, you use a fertilizer that's heavy on nitrogen because that's what that plant needs to stay in the vegetative phase, right? If it runs out of nitrogen, it's going to start flowering, Now, any plant where we want to eat the fruit or the seed, like tomatoes, peppers, squash, pretty much all the summer vegetables, cucumbers, you name it. Most of the summer vegetables are technically fruits, right? Or we eat the fruiting part of the plant. So, for the fruiting part to develop properly, it needs a lot of phosphorus, which is the second number in that fertilizer thing. So if you buy fertilizer for your tomatoes or any summer vegetables, as soon as it's out of the initial vegetative growth phase, the tomato still needs to build a plant with green stuff first too. So for the first 4 weeks you can give it a fertilizer that is heavy in nitrogen, such as a lot of compost is heavy in nitrogen. Good compost, I should say. But once it has started making flowers, you need to cut the nitrogen completely. Otherwise, it will just keep making a lot of leafy material and you get no tomatoes. Okay? So once it gets into the flowering, fruiting phase, it needs a fertilizer that's heavy in phosphorus, where the second number is the biggest number. It also needs a lot of potassium throughout, because potassium is really important for root growth. It's really important for disease resistance, making sturdy plants is what potassium is important for. So it always needs a lot of potassium. But in the vegetative growing phase, meaning greens, it needs a lot of nitrogen. In the fruiting, flowering phase, it needs a lot of phosphorus. So this is how you have to use different fertilizers, either for different plants or for different phases of your plant. It will say, and the reason why potassium is abbreviated as K is not because P is already taken by phosphorus, even though that would make sense, right? The reason why it's K is because this original nomenclature was invented by a German-speaking person, and K is kalium, which is the German name for potassium. So, in case you're wondering why that's a K. So compost was the next. So seeds again. I'm actually not totally done with seeds. So she had the great question about beans, right? And beans are one of the easiest things to grow, really. You can almost do no wrong with beans, starting from seed. It's one of the easiest seeds to grow because it's a big seed. It germinates relatively quickly. You can see what's going on. You don't have to look with a loupe, trying to see, are they germinated, are they not germinated, Did I bury them at the right depth? So we recommend when you sow seeds to bury them no deeper than twice the diameter of the seed. And a lot of seed packets are wrong. Even though I always say read the information on the seed packet, there's always great information on there. And the only information on the seed packet that's often wrong is how deep to plant the seed. I don't know why they often get that wrong. A lot of time they recommend for you to plant the seed too deep. And what happens is if you plant the seed too deep, now a seed is not only the embryo of the little plant, a seed also consists of the two seed leaves, which are basically nutrient storage for plants. So that little plant, as it germinates, uses up the nutrients that it has stored in the seed to make it to the surface. If you bury it too deep, it will use up the nutrients before it makes it to the surface and it'll die underground. So don't plant your seeds too deep. Twice the diameter of the seed is the, rule of thumb.
I planted a bunch of little tiny seeds for the first time this year.
Yeah.
And a lot of them have very wispy stems. What do I do with them?
Lack of light. Wispy stems are lack of light and lack of air movement.
Okay.
What makes stems sturdy is sunlight, not through a window, but plain sunlight. Air movement will make stems sturdy. The more they wiggle in the air, the sturdier they get. And thirdly, potassium, enough potassium. So start out with big, easy seed so you know what you're doing. And beans are super simple. The only thing you can do wrong with beans is you can plant them too early. Beans need warm soil. So you don't want to plant them too early. They will not thrive if the soil is not. And the other thing I recommend for Lake County, I don't have a lot of luck with a lot of East Coast type pole beans. They take forever to make a big enough plant before they start fruiting. By the time they start fruiting, it's 110 degrees outside. And the plant is in such stress from the heat that it cannot deliver enough nutrients to the flower and fruit. Okay? So my experience in Lake County is plant bush beans unless you use the Asian pole beans that are heat tolerant, and I brought you seeds here to take.
Can we plant some today?
Yeah, you can plant them today.
I
Like right now is a perfect time to plant beans. The only pole beans I recommend are the Asian pole beans because they're heat tolerant.
All the way out there.
Every other bean you should plant, you're better off with bush beans because they will make fruit much sooner, obviously, before it gets broiling hot. So usually by end of June you already have a harvest out of it. If you plant pole beans, they're going to start making beans like by August when it's so super hot. So let's talk about compost. Compost is my #1 favorite, most important soil amendment. for many reasons. So many reasons I can't even get into, but one of the main reasons is that compost has a lot of trace nutrients that are not in fertilizers that you buy. Okay? So a lot of the fertilizers you buy, they have NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and then if you're lucky, they still have sulfur and calcium maybe. And nowadays it's been kind of a fad to add some mycorrhizal fungi to the fertilizer if you pay an extra $20. So there's some fad nutrients that they will add because it sells. But the bottom line is there's a lot of trace minerals that your plants need in small amounts, but they need it, that are not in the fertilizer. So they usually get supplied by compost, because compost is made from plants that already had that in their bodies. Now, compost comes in hundreds of different grades, from excellent to horrible, right? The main thing I want to get into right now about compost is there's composts, especially in urban areas, that have been made by municipal composting facilities, like something like Quackenbush would be here in the Lower Lake area, and it's made from people's lawn clippings. Okay, so you can imagine if people have used a lot of herbicides on their lawns, the residues of that end up in the compost, and a lot of these chemicals are still active after they're in the compost. So there have been cases of people that killed their entire vegetable garden with compost that they got from a municipal facility because it had enough residues of herbicides in it that it literally killed their entire garden. Okay? So that's something to keep in mind. So if you get municipal compost, try to inform yourself. And it's usually made from grass clippings and people's yard waste, So that's not something I would use on my vegetables. You can use it under your ornamental shrubs, maybe, but not if you have a prized plant that you just paid $50 for. You don't want to kill it with some compost that may have herbicide in it. Another thing is horse manure, for instance. A lot of horse manure contains the residue of horse dewormer, right? Because people deworm their horses. So be aware it can kill all your earthworms if there's residue of dewormer in the horse manure. So when you get a horse manure, anyway, I'm not a big fan of horse manure for many reasons. Because it's full of weed seeds. It will introduce invasive weeds into your garden that weren't there before, that you're going to wish forever and ever you would never have gotten that free horse manure, right? It's actually only safe to use it when you bury it under, like, let's say a foot or two of soil. The other thing about compost is the nutrient content of compost varies hugely. Okay, there's, for instance, one compost company, and as master gardeners we're not allowed to recommend anything positive or negative, so I'm not going to name any names. But there's one compost company in Lake County that guarantees that if you use their compost you don't need fertilizer. It's so rich in nutrients. They actually give you a paper with a breakdown of the nutrients. So if you get compost like that, you may not even need fertilizer, But most compost that you get from a municipal compost facility that's made from ground up Christmas trees and grass clippings will not have a lot of nutrients in it, So you will still need to supply fertilizer to your plants, unless you want to constantly add fresh compost every month. So on the subject of fertilizing, I should mention here that the fertilizer you add at planting time, which always happens, right? When you plant, you mix a little fertilizer in the soil before you plant your vegetables in your bed. That fertilizer you add at planting time is used up within 6 to maximum 8 weeks. It's gone, used up by the plant. So if you have a plant in the bed that's in the bed for longer than 6 or 8 weeks, you need to, at that time, add more fertilizer afterwards. Otherwise, that plant will decline. And that's what happens in a lot of gardens. You get this bumper crop of tomatoes, and then all of a sudden, for no reason whatsoever, you're not getting a lot anymore. Well, because they ran out of fertilizer, right? So if you want to keep your tomatoes going till November, you need to add a little fertilizer every 6 to 8 weeks.
What about fertilizer for the Mediterranean herbs and the native species?
Very little.
Okay.
Compost at the most. Native plants, you don't need fertilizer. What you need is mycorrhizae. So you're going to take a little bit of soil from forest duff, basically. You go out into the area where they naturally grow, and you collect some soil there, it's like an inoculation. You're inoculating the soil with the microbes and the fungi they need. That's more important. They don't want fertilizer, actually. Okay? A little bit of compost to get them started is all they need. But be sure not to use compost that's too rich in nitrogen for your native plants. Okay? That's the compost you want for your vegetables.
Yeah.
So you get the idea. Compost can go from really good to really bad, but even the really bad compost that has almost no nutrients in it still is great for improving the structure of your soil, improving the water holding capacity, and supplying organic matter, right? So we gotta finish here, but you got our number, right? You know where to call with more questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabrielle.